So to kick us off, what brings us here is the topic of thinking about how industrials can build resilience with future-back strategy. And so really thinking about that word resilience of how do we create the foundation to have long-term success as companies continue to adapt and thrive in rapidly changing industries. And so we'll share the future-back approach and how that can bring alignment across leadership teams, clarity around direction, and those two things really drive momentum. So how do we get activity against the direction that we see in the strategy that we've set? So with that as a backdrop, wanted to share a little bit of who you're speaking to. So one, we're from Innosight, an innovation and growth strategy consulting firm, and we work with companies really thinking about how is our industry changing and how can we own the future? How can we navigate this disruptive change coming towards us and make sure that we're preempting and anticipating and positioning for that change? And we help companies really think about both where do we want to focus our attention, and then how do we go about doing that? How do we stand up innovation teams? How do we stand up new businesses in addition to our core business? And how do we actually put that change into practice? And as we talk to our clients, they tell us, we really change the way they think and see as they get outside of their current planning horizon to look beyond today, and that starts to enable them to make the change that they want to drive forward. So a little bit of the individuals that you're talking to. I'm Anna Veach. I'm a partner at Innosight, and along with Ned and a few others, we co-lead our industrial practice. My background is as an industrial engineer. Started my career in manufacturing and supply chain for SC Johnson in the consumer space. And then went and got my MBA and have been with Innosight ever since. Have worked across industry, but have really spent most of my time working within the industrial space, partnering with companies to both drive the long-term strategy and innovation. So Ned, we'll turn over to you to share a few words about your background.
That's great. Great to see everybody. Great to be here. Like Anna, I'm a recovering engineer that made the switch to consulting. Spent a number of years in the aerospace and biotech world before shifting gears. I've been with Innosight about 17 years, and do a lot of the work that Innosight does on innovation and growth, but particularly focused on industrial organizations.
Great. So we wanted to share just a couple housekeeping notes. One, just so everyone's aware, the webinar is being recorded, and the link will be shared to you as well as the presentation slides after the session. We've muted all the participants, but we have both the Q&A open as well as the chat, and would love to have folks ask questions as we go. We'll take questions as we go through the presentation, and we can really direct some of the content that we share with you as a result of those inputs. So without further ado, we want to cover three things today. So the first is sharing why the current context requires a different approach to strategy. And then we want to use that to lead into, what is the future back strategy process and what are some of the cornerstones of that approach that are really critical to doing things differently. And then we'll share a case study about how this has come to life for one of our past clients in terms of how it drove impact in their business. So on the first topic, we wanted to start with just a question for everyone. So we'll open a poll, and we'd like to ask you to look at what's your company's planning horizon. And so, on one extreme, it's hard to look past the quarter, so a lot of very, very near-term focus. In the middle, a pretty robust 2 to 3 year plan. And then, on the far right side, regularly looking out 5 to 10 years out. So getting a broader planning horizon that's informing it. So we'll give folks a couple minutes a minute to put in your answers to the poll. Let's see. Okay, so it looks like the biggest input was on that middle option. So pretty robust 2 to 3 year plan. And then a couple folks also maybe actually close to a quarter of folks actually looked at hard to look past the quarter. And then less than 10% looked at, regularly looking 5 to 10 years out. This is pretty consistent with what we see as we work with clients. The majority are in this 2 to 3 year planning horizon. Even for those that are in the 2 to 3 year planning horizon, I think when you go into the day to day, they often feel like they're much more into the hard to look past the quarter. So even though they might have the 2 to 3 year plan, a lot of the firefighting, a lot of their day is spent in, looking at the quarter, looking at very near term horizons, and really kind of a very few number feel confident that they regularly look out on the 5 to 10 year time horizon. So the spread of this group is very consistent with what we see, and this is exactly why we focus on we need a different approach. And a couple things that happen as a result of that planning horizon that's a little bit closer in is that companies don't have the processes in place and the ways to think about things that helps them get outside of that 2 to 3 year time horizon. And one of the things that we've looked at is how long does a company, what's the average longevity of a company? So this is a graph that I find quite sobering. It looks at the average life expectancy of an S&P 500 company, and over time it's been slowly decreasing. And part of this is driven by kind of the pace of change is accelerating. But a lot of it is also driven by this very near-term focus where it's hard to get outside of that planning horizon to invest in some of the longer-term change that's needed. One of the things that I've looked at even within these companies, if you break down the 500 companies on the S&P 500 and start to look at where is value accumulating, the top 5 companies make up about 25% of the market cap of the S&P 500, and all of those are tech-related companies. So even when you zoom in on a couple spaces where value is being accumulated and the consolidation of that value is getting even more extreme. And so this is one of the things that really drives what we do. How do we help companies get outside of this trend line of the life expectancy that's shrinking? How do we help companies adapt to survive over the long term? And one of the things, a quote that I love is by the late Professor Clay Christensen, who co-founded Innosight. And he talks about, research shows that good management was the most powerful reason companies failed to stay atop their industries. Precisely because these firms listened to their customers, invested aggressively in new technologies that would provide their customers more and better products of the sort they wanted, they lost their positions of leadership. And I think this is, a really sobering observation, and it really reinforces a couple things, that it's not that people were failing to look out, but they often saw some of these changes, but they started to think in a way that was very constrained by their business. How do we look at our customers of today? How do we provide them with more and better solutions that hopefully drive our bottom line, increase our profitability? And it leads to a very narrow way that they were viewing the world. And so as we think about, ways to counteract that, we think about how do you get beyond that? And one of the things that we think about is that, part of what's behind this is this idea that old maps get you lost. And there's 2 things that I want to highlight on this page. One is that what worked well before is not reliably going to help going forward. And so this first data point that says, as we look at our business, we only have historical data that we're confident about. As we start to look forward, it becomes much more assumptions based and much less certain. But what we did yesterday is not necessarily going to be the solution for tomorrow. So we're over relying on things that are backwards looking. The next 3 points really drive home, that a lot of change happens outside of the periphery of what we're looking at. So when we look at our business, we're looking at our core business, we're looking at our competitors today, but a lot of disruption starts outside of the mainstream, outside of our core customer base today. And a lot of those players experiment a lot with new business models that are in conflict and sometimes look unattractive to the core business. And so there's really a lot of the change happens outside of where we're focused today. And so you need to look beyond that periphery and look outside of that in order to understand and anticipate what change is coming. So lastly, as we think about industrials specifically, a couple things also make it harder. So we work with, as I said, a lot of industrial companies, but there are unique challenges that are specific to the industrial space that make this even more complicated. One is that you operate in a complex ecosystem of stakeholders. I think sometimes when we draw out the ecosystem map, it looks like a spaghetti chart. There are a lot of people involved that you have to think about and consider as you're driving change. And that really complicates how you can think about bringing a new solution to the market. The other thing is that the industrial companies need to think about both the B2B and the B2C customer. So you're thinking about change on two levels, both what's impacting your immediate business, but also the customers that your customer is serving. And unless you start to anticipate those layers of change, you can't fully see the level of change coming. And then the other thing is that there's a lot of change constantly going on across the value chain within industrial companies. So consolidation, vertical integration, and how you think about the dynamics with different players around you are constantly changing. Industrial companies, your customer is often your competitor, and who you're serving on one side, you're competing with in the other area. And this makes for a more complicated context. And then the other thing is that companies, especially in the industrial space, are undergoing a major shift from product to solution. And whereas if we looked historically, the products themselves were incredibly complex, sophisticated engineering products driven by really deep R&D processes. Now, on top of that, companies need to wrestle with how is this product connected? What does that connected ecosystem look like? And how do we bring that to market? And so the complexity is just amplifying as we look forward. So these are a couple challenges that we see that make the context specifically hard for industrial companies, but wanted to just turn to you all and think about what are some of the other challenges that you see that are specifically impacting your industry or the industrial space that you see driving additional complexity as you try to navigate moving forward. So if you can just enter it into the chat, and would love for people to share some of the other things that you see getting in the way. Regulatory. So that's a great one. That comes up all the time across the different industries in terms of how you can influence, but you're also subject to it, and a lot of just navigation of that. Embedding AI in all of the above. So yeah, if we throw on a whole nother layer of complexity, it's how does this technology change the dynamics of all of those four things that were already complex? Big tech and deep pockets. So we're often looking at both partners and competitors as we think about solutions, and how do we think about these companies and our interaction and how to innovate there. So great things. Yeah, a tsunami of new technologies, and not only coming on, but at an accelerating pace. So yeah, a number of things that these four things are just the starting point, and as you named those, there are many things that layer on to make these even more complicated. So with this setup, the challenge is real, and we want to jump into the future back approach and how we think about working with companies as they're navigating. So Ned, I'll hand over to you to talk through the future back approach.
Yeah, thanks, Jana. Great. We'll keep some of those challenges in mind. I'm not sure that we're going to solve all of them, but hopefully we'll give you some lenses that guide the way to make progress. So we want to spend the next maybe 15 or so minutes talking a little bit about our approach for dealing with that level of change and how you get organizations to think longer term and more expansively about strategy. And I think it starts with the fundamental challenge that underlies a lot of this and goes back to where the poll conversation started, that a lot of organizations, their current strategic planning processes are maybe in best case kind of 2 to 3 years out, and oftentimes a lot shorter than that. They're kind of a yearly event that we do. More often than not, they're kind of a check the box activity where we assume some degree of stability in the market. We take what we're doing today, we kind of project it out and try to grow it at the margins. And I'm exaggerating, but maybe not exaggerating that much. And look, that's not necessarily a bad thing, per se. If your market is in a period of stability or is, growing on a trajectory, and there aren't a lot of disruptive forces, that's not a bad way to, run the business. But what it leads to is, opportunities for, look a lot like, the opportunities that you're in today. Um, if you find yourself in a situation, similar to what Anna described above, where there actually are a lot of disruptive forces, and we've seen some in the chat, AI being, a great one, but every industry has their own, set of things that they're, wrestling with. That type of process can be, quite limiting. And so the philosophy and the approach that, we try to instill in organizations is what we call a future back approach to strategy. And that really starts from a different vantage point. It starts not with where we are today, but really where do we see the world going over a longer time scale. Look 5, 10 years out. It will depend on the industry you're in, whether 5 years is a long time, or in some industries 15 or 20 years is an appropriate time scale that extends beyond the existing planning horizon. But we want you to look further out. We want you to look more expansively at the trends and forces that are impacting your industry, and how those might come together to really create fundamental shifts in the ecosystem and create new opportunities. And then with that as a North Star and alignment on where we want to take the organization over the long term, then we can start to walk back to how do we need to start shifting investments? How do we need to start shifting our activities today to start to move us in a direction, towards that different, future. So that's what we're going to spend some time on, is just unpacking that idea of future back and some of the core elements. Obviously, we won't get into every facet of it, but we wanted to share some of the cornerstones for doing that type of process and share some stories along the way. And maybe Anna, click to the next slide. So one of the reasons that this approach can be quite powerful in organizations is it connects a long-term strategy for the organization with how we're allocating resources today. And this is a problem that I think we've lived through and felt very viscerally. In the very earliest days of Innosight, one of our business lines was operating essentially as an outsourced incubator for large organizations. They would have a problem that didn't fit with the current business model. They would hire Innosight to do the market research, design a new business model, help them with piloting, and testing. And I'd like to think we did some great work. We identified, kind of really compelling, opportunities, but we would always run into this challenge is we'd bring them back into the organization. And then when it came time to, apply, proper resources, both in terms of people and dollars, all those resources were already, occupied by the core, business. It's not like many organizations have a rainy day fund just waiting around, for an opportunity to crop up that they can, fund. And so there wasn't, context for why we should be investing in things that are outside of our core business that have a longer, time horizon, because that strategic planning process really only looked, a couple of years out, and those things seemed less relevant. They seemed less attractive financially to the things that we're, doing today. And so one of the early activities that we do with clients that really is foundational for the future back process is help them to articulate and understand what their long-term financial and strategic ambitions are. How are we trying to grow the company? What's our goal? And then look really hard at what can the current business do to contribute to that. Inevitably, over the right time scale, most core businesses, as Anna talked about in that first chart, decline, and so that creates the mandate. We've got to fill that gap between what our core business can contribute and our overall aspiration with new opportunities, new sources of innovation. And so once you have the leadership team aligned on what we're doing today will ultimately be insufficient, we need to do other things, that then can create the mandate and help facilitate the resource allocation question, so that you get the balance right between continuing to invest and fund the things that are going to drive the performance over the near term, but not sacrificing the long term, and making sure that we're allocating the appropriate amount of resources to new opportunities, new bets that will pay off over a medium to longer term horizon. So this connection between long term and near term resource allocation is really a core part of future back. Three real cornerstones to the future back approach that we wanted to unpack a little bit here. One is this idea of getting the organization aligned on what is that future going to look like, and admittedly 5 or 10 years out it's going to be more of an impressionist painting than a photograph, but we need to have some perspective on how these various forces will come together and reshape our market. So we want to talk a little bit about that. The second is, how do we understand what's going to matter to customers in the future? We want that to be an anchor to anything that we do from an innovation or growth perspective. What types of questions do we need to ask of our customers and our markets to understand what problems are going to be most important to focus on? And then thirdly, an inherent tension when you move further out is that it's very difficult, to predict, what specific, product or specific business model is going to, be the right one, in 10 years. So how do we find the right balance between setting clear direction so the organization can move forward with some coherence, but at the same time, respecting that, uncertainty, and allowing our teams to have the right space to learn and adapt as that future unfolds. So we'll talk a little bit about one lens for doing that. So if we dive in on this first one of the future, environment, and really, getting a sense of, how various forces are going to come together. I guess what I would say is, every organization does trends. I'm sure all of your, companies have worked, ongoing, looking at trends in the markets and, how they play together. What may be different in a future back process is we're taking a much more expansive view of the trends that could, impact our ecosystem. Things that are maybe happening on the periphery or adjacent markets, unlikely to be relevant, in a 12 or 18-month window. But if we look longer term and understand how technology could, develop and spill over, may become relevant. So we're asking, to look more broadly and look longer term. That's a core element of what we're trying to do here. Two really common failure modes when you try to get an organization to embrace that longer, term horizon and a broader view of the trends. One is that, and it goes back to, kind of the fundamental disconnect between existing strategy processes and future back one, is there's not often a strong coupling, between functions and groups that are doing long-term forecasting and really trying to understand where markets are going over the long term, and the detailed strategic planning processes that are happening in today. This was, I think there's one experience that really stands out to me here is that, we were working with a Fortune 100, chemical company on a long-term strategy. We were engaged in one of these future back processes, and probably about, I don't know, maybe 2/3 of the way, through it, after we had already done a lot of, work on trends in future environment and were, surfacing opportunities. One of the executives in a meeting said, "Hey, have you talked to our future trend group?" And they actually had an entire, group of, I don't know, it must have been, 5 or 6, people who were working on long-term changes, in their industry. And they were doing really interesting, work, looking at deep shifts to demographics and socioeconomic things, things that would be really important for shaping, the future of the organization. But they were sort of, holed away on, the fourth floor in the corner. And the work that they were doing really wasn't connected to how leaders in the organization, made decision-making processes. And in fact, like their decision-making process, as it existed, didn't really have a mechanism to contemplate the things that they were, suggesting. And so you've got to be, thinking about how do we need to evolve and redesign our strategic planning processes so that we can connect in some of those, parts of the organization that may be thinking in a more future-oriented way. The other, I would say, major challenge we see when organizations try to, move on this is, they're willing to look longer term, but they really only drive towards fairly superficial alignment on the issues. And a good example of this, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, we were working with one of the big auto OEMs, and they were starting to grapple with issues of electrification and autonomy and connectivity and some of the various forces that are transforming that industry. And we would go around to each of the executives and ask their perspective on how they saw the world unfolding. And And all of them, to a single one would say electrification. Yeah, that's the future. The world is definitely going to be electrified. That's going to be, really important. But what was interesting is if you clicked, one or two levels down and started to ask questions about, where did they see that phenomenon starting? Was it going to be China, Europe, North America? What did that adoption curve look like? Was it going to be, kind of slow and steady over a, 20 or 30-year period, or would it reach an inflection point and move relatively quickly? If you ask them, is this going to be a kind of traditional automotive starting sort of the high end of the market, and as the technology costs come down, sort of trickle down, or were there opportunities for this to take a more classically disruptive pathway and start sort of in the low end of the market where the technology is maybe good enough and you focus on very specific circumstances, and then it would grow and extend over time. You would find wildly divergent answers to those questions. And so while they were superficially aligned on electrification being important, the details, they were all over the map. And so you can imagine that when it came time to set strategy, to make decisions on what types of products they should prioritize, make decisions on where to allocate resources, the whole thing kind of ground to a halt. And so the other thing that tends to be very important is to get much more specific and much more granular about the assumptions that we want to make about how the world is going to evolve. And of course, that can be inclusive of the inherent uncertainties when looking that far out. But we want to be very specific on those things so that we can get the leadership and then the rest of the organization aligned on a very common perspective. So a couple thoughts on future environment. Maybe if we dive to the next page. So related to that, another really core issue is, when you're looking 5 or 10 years out, customers are extremely unreliable at telling you the specific features and functionality that will be relevant in that time frame. It's kind of goes back to the old Henry Ford adage that, if you had asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster, horse. And customers, like anyone else, are biased by the world that they live in today. They don't necessarily understand the art of the possible from a technology perspective, and so they tend to riff off of what their experience is. One way around this that we found quite powerful and quite helpful in these future back situations is to ask a different question. So as opposed to asking customers, what do you want or what do you need in the future, we step back and really try to anchor ourselves to the problems that they're going to face. What are the big challenging problems that are unlikely to be solved by existing solutions but will matter to customers? If we can get grounded in those, then as an organization we can take away and figure out what's the ideal solution, factoring in all the various forces that are impacting the industry. So maybe an example of that, sticking with automotive, for a second, since we've been talking about it, if you were back in, call it 2008, 2010, and asked, your average customer, do they want an electric vehicle? The answer would probably be no. They would be highly biased by, the very few things that were on the market that were highly compromised, products through certain lenses, whether it was, their packaging, their aesthetics, their range, what have you, and kind of reinforced the notion that electric vehicles were sort of glorified, golf carts that really weren't going to satisfy the needs of the majority of consumers. And so you could be very misled around, the desire for electric vehicles and not prioritize that, in your, overall portfolio. And, I think we saw a lot of the traditional, OEMs, were slow to, adopt here, because of that. Admittedly, there were other factors around the cost and those things that were, kind of real barriers. But nevertheless, I think, there was some bias in that. If you contrast that, for example, with, Tesla, I'm not sure whether they actually used jobs to be done, but they were clearly asking very different questions. They were asking, is concerns around sustainability going to be more or less important, in the future? And if you looked at, a lot of the macroeconomic factors and what was going on, you'd probably say, much more important. Are they going to ask themselves, do people still want, exciting, vehicles that offer, distinct performance. Yeah, sure. There's no reason to think that that would, go away. Are cars still going to be, status symbols where, customers are looking for something that stands out and is differentiated? Yeah, check. And so you start to ask those questions and put those together, and you can imagine, well, there actually is a solution out there that could be, compelling, but you wouldn't necessarily get that by simply asking customers, what they needed. And so we find this language around the jobs to be done, the problem or a goal that a customer is trying to face in a particular circumstance can be a really helpful, sort of language system, for organizations and ground in real problems that are going to be relevant in the future that we might want to think about trying to solve. And then the last topic I'll touch on, quickly, I highlighted earlier this tension of, we're looking, 10 years out and trying to set, direction to drive, coordinated action within the, organization. At the same time, we want to respect that, that things will need to evolve. There's actually a lot of good research that most successful ventures change, direction 4 or 5 times before they ultimately find, a successful solution and business model. And so we need a lens that, allows us that direction, but also the flexibility. One lens that we found quite helpful is this idea of, strategic opportunity areas. And really, strategic opportunity area has 3 core elements. One is a sense of a priority customer. So what group of individuals is going to be a meaningful stakeholder, in that future? They're likely to persist. Second, circle around going back to that idea of priority, job to be done. So for those individuals, what are going to be the really important and unsatisfied problems that they're going to be, wrestling with? And then a third piece around not necessarily a specific product or a specific business model yet, but a broad sense of how we can be, relevant. What types of solutions, what types of business models, can we bring to bear on those problems for those customers? That can provide, a lot of direction. The intersection of those things can be analyzable, in terms of size and capabilities and those sort of things. So you can compare and, contrast them. And they can provide a consistent direction that then teams can pursue individual opportunities that nest into that broader, construct. So that's another lens that we found, quite helpful. And we'll spend a little bit more time on examples of it in the next section.
Great. So we wanted to, as Ned has walked through those, shared a lot of case study anecdotes and clients that we've worked with, but wanted to just share one more as we think about how the future back approach has been brought to life with some of our clients. And so wanted to share an example of working with a global third-party logistics provider. And when we started the engagement with this company, they were really coming off of over 3 decades of really strong, incredible growth. And if you think about just the explosion of global business as companies were really expanding, late 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and the extent of global trade to coordinate. There are a lot of global 3PLs that grew as that changing dynamic was just continuing to get more and more complex. And when we worked with when we partnered with this company, they were starting to say, yes, we've seen all that. It's been a great history, but we're also seeing a lot of changes that are coming up on the horizon. So one, they've been a great partner and brought a lot of technology solutions to their customers, but they were starting to grapple with, hey, we're in a highly fragmented market. Data and analytics are really progressing. How do we help people navigate? Who can get to the next level of aggregation to get to insights and visibility around the supply chain? We're seeing a lot of technological changes around automation, autonomy, electrification, and even blockchain in terms of how supply chains are being managed. We're seeing our big customers get even bigger and vertically integrating and thinking about how they're taking on an even greater part of their logistics, both nationally and globally. And we really see new digital business models. So new startups coming in and challenging with kind of leaner models that are digitally native, that appeal to customers that we've maybe not served as well in the past. And so they really saw all these trends impacting their industry and wanted to grapple with what can we do around these, and what should our response be, and what opportunities will come up. And so we worked with this leadership team to, one, articulate those sets of trends. As Ned said, what are all the things that are shaping your industry? But then we walked through, how could your ecosystem actually look different? So when we think about data aggregators, and everybody's played in their part of the node, how do we see new players that will stretch across the value chain? And what does that look like for the IT infrastructure around it? How do we see the customers that we've historically served? How do we see them changing and further consolidating and growing? And how do we see customers that we haven't been serving as much? And how do we see the change happening within the smaller customers? So really walk through all the different changes in the ecosystem and the early evidence. Where do we see startups coming onto the scene? Where do we see people getting traction that start to show that these changes are in flight already, and are starting to we're starting to see the signals of traction. And then we identified a couple places where they wanted to focus, and really thinking about, there's many changes going on across that we've talked about. What are the 4 to 6 where we think we have a right to win because of the capabilities that we have in house, because of how we've historically interacted with customers? Where do we have a differentiated ability to jump into these areas and really make a difference? And so one of the things that they did coming out of the project, as they aligned on the strategy, was they set up an innovation team, and they set up venture groups within that. And I'll just highlight one of the areas. So one of the places that they looked at was, traditionally small customers have been harder to serve. It's not a whole lot of business from each customer. There's a lot more hand holding, and it doesn't lend as well to their higher touch model. But they were starting to see kind of digital offerings from some startups that were lower overhead and were more amenable to some of those smaller customers. And they started to say there's a huge, small business really drives a lot of the economy. There's a lot of customers to serve here. How can we think about better serving those customers? And so what they did was they actually oriented a venture team around that, started up a new business, a new brand, used M&A to actually acquire some technology that would underpin it, but really started up an independent group, still under the parent company, but to target that specific customer. It was the job around managing their global logistics, but they traditionally had many more barriers that they were encountering as opposed to the larger customer group. And they created a business model that contrasted from their higher touch version to be a lower touch version that was right sized for the customer needs. And so they started that up a number of years ago. It's now a growing, thriving business that really targets a new customer group that was outside of their core constituency. And they work really well together. And you even see positive transfer between what they've been able to do with that customer, how they're able to bring those innovations into their core customer group. And so I think that's an example, if we go all the way from the start, to say, change happens on the fringe outside of your core business. They stood up a business to start serving those customers, were really disciplined about the opportunity that they were going after. And then you start to see actual positive transfer from that new idea back to their core business. So really, a company that started start to finish on how do we see this change? How do we identify opportunities? And how do we pragmatically go after it? So I'll pause there and wanted to just move to one. We'll put an article into the chat that just kind of talks through the future back approach, especially as it's relevant for industrial organizations. So if you want to go deeper into this topic, would encourage you to go there, and then want to just open up the floor for Q&A. You can send any questions in the chat. I think the chat is actually the best way to do it. Or the Q&A box. So if there are any questions that folks have, we'd love to take them. Not too many.
Yeah, quiet group today, but that's great. We appreciate everybody's time, listening into us, and hopefully you got something out of it. I encourage you to reach out to Anna or I, after if helpful. we're always happy to, chat offline and, learn more about specific situations and provide any, thoughts. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Couple things. We just put the article in the chat. Question. We can hang on here for just a minute to see if anyone else has it. Oh, okay. See one coming in, Eugenio. Is culture change a prerequisite for a successful future back strategy initiative? Great question. We often think of these as they go hand in hand. It's really hard to untangle big strategy change from the culture change that's required around it. So, I would say there's not a single project that we go into where both of these pieces aren't huge parts of the conversation. But I think that there's two pieces. One, understanding the baseline culture and how receptive is it to new ideas, and what are the behaviors that encourage innovation and change around that. So understanding what is the existing culture and how strong are the behaviors already that are embedded in terms of being able to adapt and try new ideas. And then what's required to support the types of strategic ideas identified, and really think about how far are those from the core business. And so, in many of these situations, we do see opportunity that goes quite far from the core business, and that often does require a really different mindset, a different level of experimentation. So very often we see that where we've identified the business needs to go is pretty different from today, and that does require a different set of capabilities, mindsets, behaviors to encourage. We have both of our emails on the screen, and would love to just encourage, as you've listened to this conversation, if this is something that you see the potential or the impact of, we'd love to follow up with you and have further discussions around this. Or if there are other questions that just come to mind as you're leaving this conversation or as you're reading the article, we're always happy to have further questions about further discussion around this. I'm just watching a couple more questions coming in. Is adopting jobs to be done essential to this approach? So one thing that I'll say is, we really think the jobs to be done methodology is incredibly powerful in focusing on the underlying customer problem to be solved or the customer need. But that doesn't mean that companies aren't already thinking about the customer very strongly and what the need is. So it's not necessarily this terminology has to be it. But at the end of the day, really understanding what's the customer willing to buy has to be at the foundation of where you see future opportunity. So it's not necessarily that this terminology has to be the guiding piece, but having a very clear-eyed view of what the customer is looking for and what they're ultimately going to be willing to pay for has to be a foundational piece. So I would say we often kind of balance those two things. How do we make sure the customer is at the center in identifying opportunities? But also, it doesn't necessarily have to be this terminology, this language around it, just as long as that underlying sentiment and customer understanding is there. It's a great question. Well, thanks all. I think questions are starting to slow. And as we try to aim for, we try to give you back a little bit of time from what was held, so you have a couple extra minutes in your day. But look forward to speaking to anyone as you have questions come up. And with that, have a wonderful rest of your day.